Welcome to URI and our Landscape Architecture Lecture Series. We'll be getting underway shortly, but before we do, I'd like to bring you a short video about the College of Arts and Sciences. It will be followed by a few words from our Dean, Jen Riley.
Nobody is going to ever replace the capacity of a human. And this is why thinking is our number one obsession.
What's great about URI, especially in arts and sciences, we're a liberal arts college within a bigger school. And so you get that liberal arts feel, but you also get the ability to do research. We, as the flagship school of our state, do cutting edge work.
You have to really look at schools as a place to grow as yourself. You're not going to be handheld anymore. This is a time for you to really delve into yourself and find what you like. It needs to be somewhere that you're going to find to be a home, but also a place to build yourself. And I think that URI does a great job of that.
Students learn when they engage and get their own hands in that material. You're going to construct knowledge. You're going to do research. That's what creates transformative experiences. That's what creates people who are passionate about learning.
Rather than simply acquiring a body of knowledge, they themselves are developing in a way that keeps them agile, constantly able to re-educate themselves, constantly able to think critically, to adapt to new ways of learning, new ways of thinking, and to keep evolving throughout the course of a life.
Undergraduate liberal arts education is so transformative to the mind, to who you are.
The humanities and the arts are there to help you explore the fringes of what's possible, and understanding how you can look at the world in new and different ways and be ready whenever changes happen.
Multiculturalism and multidisciplinarity are very important because it gives you a unique perspective. You see students are actually excited to see people that think about problems from a different perspective. Problem solving can be attacked from different points of view.
It's nice to be able to come to a school where there's like so many different narratives, so many different perspectives. There's a place for everybody.
I think really what URI has to offer is the people and the opportunities. The people around you, they're all going to help you grow in ways that you've never understood before.
I think there's a lot of people, students in particular, that are just excited that whatever field they're in, they want to be the best at it. There's a sense of pride in the work that you put out there, and I think that's kind of infectious.
A College of Arts and Sciences education gives you the confidence to bring together all the strands that you value and apply them in ways that are fulfilling for you as an individual, but also resonate out.
The thing that sets URI apart is that we as a faculty and as an institution ask our students not just what you can do, but who can you be?
We're a small place, there's no denying that. I kind of think we're like a best kept secret.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jen Riley, and I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's Landscape Architecture lecture. It's great to have the community join us virtually. Normally we'd be meeting in Beaupre. We'd have 100 people in the room, and COVID-19 has sort of altered how we do things. But the advantage of this virtual one is that we've had alumni join us from across the country. So wherever you're located, welcome to our URI alumni, and welcome to our community members who are joining us. This series from Landscape Architecture is a valuable event, not just for the community, but for our students who have the opportunity to learn from practitioners in the field and really gain from their experience as our students think about their own careers that they're building. I have to give a shout out because he won't take credit publicly for all of this, but this series is really due to Will Green and the work he puts into it every year. He always creates a series that speaks to the moment. This year, they're looking at issues of equity and inclusion, design, activism, and more. We end up, due to Will's great thinking and his connections and who he brings in for these events, with wonderful learning experiences for all of us. I hope you enjoy tonight's lecture with Diana Fernandez.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jen. I'm Will Green. I'm the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, and I want to welcome you to our fourth lecture in our year-long series, and as Jen pointed out, on activism, equity, and environmental justice. Before we begin, I'd like to thank a few individuals who work in the background, and they help make this series possible. Lisa Smolensky, our administrative assistant, students Lindsay Corsi and Miranda Yoon, who are both seniors in our BLA program, and Leah Cooper of the Harrington School, who helps us produce and stream this lecture series. Our sponsors are the College of Arts and Sciences, the university's libraries, the Department of Art and Art History, Rhode Island chapter of ASLA, the Landscape Forums, the G.P. Fiala Endowment, and this week we added a new sponsor, the Landscape Architecture Department from the University of Connecticut. This is our 28th year, and we are asking our guests to share with us their thoughts, their methods, their projects that are focused on landscape architecture, activism, equity, and environmental justice. Our viewers are encouraged to submit questions. To do so, type your question in the comments box, which is up on your right or my right. It's on the side of your screen. We will be selecting questions during the presentation, and we'll ask our guest this evening for responses at the conclusion of her presentation. Please note that our next speaker will be Signe Nielsen of Matthews Nielsen Landscape Architecture, and that will be on the 19th, same time, same place. This evening, we're honored to have a return visit by landscape architect Diana Fernandez. She's an associate with Sasaki Associates in Watertown, and this is a return visit for her. Diana is a licensed landscape architect who received a Bachelor's of Science in Landscape Architecture from Temple University. She has been with Sasaki for more than 5 years and worked at firms in Maine and Philadelphia prior to joining the firm, but based on her visibility and accomplishments, it's amazing that she's done all of this in such a short time. She is seen as a designer, a collaborator, and a critical thinker. She leads and advocates for diversity in design and planning. Her work has taken her to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Clemson University, Boston College. She's worked on the revitalization of the Wilmington waterfront promenade for the Port of Los Angeles. She's been writing and speaking on the topic of diversity in design for a number of years. She was an equity and inclusion panelist for the Landscape Architecture Foundation in 2018, and a presenter on panels at the national ASLA conferences and at state conferences in Texas, Chicago, Illinois, and in Florida. She's a sought-after speaker, and we have her again. Her work has been honored by the Boston Society of Landscape Architects, the New Jersey chapter. She was an Urban Land Institute Open Space Award finalist. She was selected as a leadership fellow by the Landscape Architecture Foundation. And most recently, and quite exciting, is that Diana was awarded by ASLA its inaugural Emerging Professionals Medal. I am pleased to be able to welcome again Diana Fernandez.
Thank you so much, Will. What a wonderful opportunity to be here with you all and to really dial into the work that I'm super passionate about and I think is so relevant, I think, in the times that we all are facing today. And I just want to thank URI again for hosting me. It was such a blast to do presentation last year, and it was just a great experience for me, and I'm super excited to be back here to share some new work. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see my screen here? There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and take that as a yes. So tonight I want to talk to you all about the research I've been doing around heterogeneous futures, design thinking alternatives for anthropologically and ecologically diverse landscapes. And it's certainly a jargonful to say, but you know, I was really drawn to this concept of heterogeneity when I really started to dial into the landscape ecology doctrine, and particularly how heterogeneity as a principle is used often to define diversity and to really think about ways in which diverse characteristics can define these ecosystems as a means for sort of building resilience and creating this sort of evolutionary advantage. And what's fascinating about this is that it's a term that's not just specific to landscape ecology, but it's also used in the biological sciences. And in many ways, it has come to define diversity in ways that I think are more inclusive of the types of ecosystems and services landscape architecture can serve. And you know, I always like to say that when I arrived at this work, it really found me. I absolutely love being a landscape architect, and I always found myself asking, you know, we're so good at designing for the birds and the bees, but when it comes to human society and human experiences, I just felt there was a disconnect there. I felt like where's the diversity for social, cultural, and linguistic systems that are often such a critical part and indicators for ecological diversity? And it really brought me to really kind of taking a very deep dive into how we can think about heterogeneity in this sort of anthropological lens, how we can understand that it's not just about sort of the compositional nature of these ecosystems, but configurationally how you think about increasing human diversity into these spaces. And it was fascinating because when I started my work, there's so much literature there about the correlation between language, the languages spoken within a particular system or land area, and the diversity of the ecologies within them. And I think, again, it's this approach where I'm trying not to sort of put ecology and anthropology in these sort of two separate buckets, but think about them working in unison together and how we can think about applying these principles to those social, cultural, linguistic systems that are so important to the success of our landscapes. And, you know, this is important, you know, in the American context because America is evolving and changing. And I really love these maps that were put together by ULI that really look at how race across America is really changing. And obviously, this is not inclusive of all races represented here, but I think it starts to paint a picture about how much change is actually happening within our societies, and particularly that how this is not just happening on the coast, you know, this is happening in middle America, and it's an important ecosystem that we need to pay close attention to as we continue as designers. And I always joke around because I think this is kind of a funny little diagram, but I tried to really simplify this concept because my research is trying to bring this sort of thorough analysis of ecological systems and trying to marry that with this deep understanding of these human characteristics that shape our landscapes in hopes of creating what I'm sort of terming here as a sort of landscape heterogeneity as a process that really starts to shape the way in which we think about landscape architecture and practice. And I love to start with this image because it really, kind of paints a clear picture for me. When I talk about landscape heterogeneity, I always come back to this image. I come back to the fact that we as a human species are defined by heterogeneity. Our planet comes from that. In many ways, the biodiversity that makes us who we are and has allowed us to evolve over so many millions of years is the thing that defines us as a human system. And I'm so interested as a landscape architect to really start tapping into that biodiversity, tapping into that inherent heterogeneity as a way in which we can think about landscape processes. And for me, it's very personal. I have to say that my work is always a reflection of my identity. And that identity is of being an Afro-Latina. I come from the Dominican Republic, and this island, Hispaniola, was the start of the transatlantic slave trade. And it sort of defined me as a designer in ways that I'm now just uncovering. And for me, my relationship to the land, these are images of the village I grew up in. We didn't have running water, we didn't have electricity, but there was a sort of deep connection to land, and there weren't any landscape architects here, but we were creating landscapes like you see on the left. This is underneath the mango tree, and was built by community. And you can see the sort of vibrancy of colors that are indicative of the tropical fauna that's so prolific in this island. And again, it just, to me, this was what landscape architecture was, even though I had no idea that's what I was sort of experiencing. And it brings me to a point I want to make here and be very clear about, which is that lived experiences matter. And I just shared with you all my lived experience as somebody coming from the Dominican Republic. But when we think about the creation of the public realm, we really have to pay close attention to how we are allowing these lived experiences to be integral parts of the way in which we shape landscapes, and particularly how we define new design vernaculars that help us understand the many different ways in which landscape operates across cultures. And before I kind of get into the meat of this presentation, I really want to talk about this journey I went on. I think this research for me, this work around landscape heterogeneity, is really defined by unlearning and particularly debunking some of the perceptions we have of landscape architecture. And I want to start with the first myth. And this is my opinion, but we're often told that landscapes are universal, that they're welcoming for everybody, that it's common ground. And I think that is the furthest thing from what landscape architecture is. When we think about the context of America, it is inherently unequal. It is never common ground. When we think about who could own property and who was considered property themselves, paints a different picture about what we say when we say that this is welcoming, that it's common ground for us all. And we see this manifest itself in, this sort of, this interesting image, right? These postcards of the West, right? Conquering the wild land, Olmsted discovering national parks. These lands had been managed and designed by indigenous communities for so many millions of years. And it's so important for us to be able to acknowledge that these lands were never ours. And we continue to operate on many of these lands that are stolen and on broken treaties. And this also manifests itself in many modern day contexts. So when we think about loitering laws that tell us who and whom is supposed to use public space and how, to the sort of 400 years of oppression of seeing Black and brown bodies, murdered on public land and within that public realm. So, to me, landscape architecture is the most poignant expression of power. And in this American context, it is about white power over communities, BIPOC communities in most cases. And this has been institutionalized within our design processes and has led us to the creation of homogeneous space making. And when I talk about homogeneous space making, it's really at its core really talking about utopias. It's sort of this desire to create perfect societies at the expense, right, of everybody else's identity. And it starts with, the institutions and structural systems themselves in the form of firms or in the form of government agencies that define who is capable of doing this work within their communities, to, the design process and education system itself. When we enter design school, we're basically stripped of every lived experience we have of landscape and often re-educated under an Anglo lens that really presents one way in which to create public space. And then finally, sort of design and construction itself. This is not about just thinking of, creating these perfectly beautiful and manicured spaces, but we don't make any room within the design process to allow for different design vernaculars to emerge. And particularly in many cases, these designs are done in a way to exclude. When we have center armrests within benches to deter the homeless, or ordinances that require skate deterrence. Again, we're designing for the few and not for the many. And again, all of these things work in concert together to create this sort of plethora of homogeneous spaces that define our profession today. So that was a lot. So what do we do about it? What can we as landscape architects do? And this leads me to sort of the core of my work, which is really thinking about landscape heterogeneity as a process. And I want to share a couple of sort of indicators and case studies that have really guided the transformation and implementation of this work. So, when I first started my research with the Landscape Architecture Foundation, I immediately thought I was going to create a framework. I was going to create this platform that could be replicated across scales. And, I emerged out of that fellowship with a completely different take. What I present to you today isn't a framework. It's actually a state of consciousness. It's about making the space for unlearning that's necessary for us to allow new positive learning to occur, for us to really sort of rinse ourselves of all of this tragedy, right, that has defined the profession, and enter new perspectives that give us and make the space for communities that are often underrepresented to be sort of critical players within the profession. And I don't know if you guys listen to podcasts, but Jenna Wortham and Wellesley Morris, they're both with the New York Times and the Culture Writers. And I love this quote from her, and they have this amazing podcast called Still Processing that really dials into this work in a meaningful way and really talks about culture and representation in ways that we as landscape architects should be picking up on as well. And again, I think some of those indicators that were critical in the formation of landscape heterogeneity as a process is thinking about, how do landscapes create spaces of joy, as an act of rebellion, right? How do you embrace pluralism? What does intersectionality look like in a landscape? What does it mean to nourish communities, not just like with food, but like spiritually? And how can landscape get us there? And the first project I want to share with you all is the work we've been doing at the Frederick Douglass Memorial. here in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. And this project just happened to land right when I was starting my research, and it was a perfect sort of testing ground to test some of these ideas. And the images you see on the screen, you may look at them and say, wow, there's so much disinvestment here, right? This is a space that is not beloved. But I would sort of question your assumptions. This space was designed with such intention that it actually is functioning at a very high social level for the community in place. And particularly in this neighborhood, it's the Roxbury community that's primarily Black and African American, and really talks about the circular planters you see in this image were purposely done so because they're meant to ward off evil spirits, which is a really important part of sort of African American gardens. It's such a shame I don't have the image here, but it was amazing because we saw furniture used in a different way. So people brought chairs from their homes and sort of haphazardly placed them throughout the site. And, this is where they came out on the weekends to play cards and congregate with friends. So again, I think, there is this question about, this space may be seen as an eyesore to some, but it actually is functioning at a very high level for others. And there is a sense of grit, of sort of lack of perfection here that really sort of speaks to community. And one last point I want to make on this image is that I'm also not trying to romanticize disinvestment. I think we're all clear here about the lack of investment in communities of color. But what I do want to say is let's not conflate disinvestment without understanding what inherent beauty and resilience is already built into these places. And when we started this design process, it was really amazing because we kind of threw away everything we knew about public engagement. We knew that this community had been hurting for a very long time. It's a neighborhood that's quickly gentrifying, and that the site in which we were operating from, had been the Frederick Douglass Square for over 120 years. And this was the first time we were getting closer to implementing and erecting a memorial in its place. So, with all of that in mind, my team and I were really focusing on how do we change that dynamic. And, we really honed in on how do we make the room for healing, right? We're not just going to come into this community and show them a bunch of really beautiful precedent images that have no sense of place and that are not reflective of their own experiences on the ground. So we worked with Des Polk, who's this amazing spoken word artist out of Roxbury, to, our initial session was a spoken word performance. And it was one of the most powerful things I have been a part of as a practitioner because it opened the room up. We made the room for people to ask questions about, what public realm means. What is open space? To them, this, the public realm isn't public at all. It's where often they are harassed, where injustices are enacted. And, that really led us to a point where we could kind of open the room up, understand what elements were missing, really break down the language, because I think something that's so important about our decision to use spoken word here is that it broke the linguistic barriers and divides that often precludes us from having meaningful engagement with the community, and really sort of led us to a space of imagination and to the sort of vision that is really thinking about this sort of palimpsest of histories, right? That the site and our material selection, the plants, all of it is sort of evoking this African diaspora and Douglass's legacy in all of these ways. But also thinking about, what does it mean in modern context? It's great to erect a memorial and a statue, but how do we think about living preservation within the site? To be able to sort of manifest this vision for the community, which was really about how do we create not just this memorial where this statue can be erected, but how do we create a Black landscape that when you arrive, the soil you are on, the pavers, the planters, everything is speaking to you and telling you about the legacy of sort of the Black community in this part of Boston. Another project I'm super excited to share with you guys, and I think I shared a little bit of this with you all last year, is the Pulse competition we did with Mass Design Group. And this was an amazing collaboration because not only, was it a team of amazing architects and landscape architects and urban designers, but, from the very beginning, we had artists like Sanford Biggers, and we had Poet Laureate in Boston and the sort of National Poet Laureate as integral parts of our team. And I think it really shaped our understanding and thinking about how these spaces could sort of unfold. And it was interesting because, when we started these conversations and we think about the Pulse sort of memorial, this was a space that is, the majority of the victims were of Latinx background. Many of them may or may have not been sort of open about their identities to the world. And, it really posed this question for us about how do we think about the public realm itself really working to tell that story, right? To be able to commemorate their lives and their legacy in a way that embraces that intersectionality, that embraces, what a queer ecology could actually be and look like. And it really led us to this sort of approach to the landscape design that is really thinking about how do we make the space for different types of reflection and mourning. As an Afro-Latina myself, I know that from personal experience, mourning, in the Caribbean is loud, it's performative, it's not the sort of somber experience that is often portrayed in the United States in memorials. So, we wanted to make the room within our site to allow for these performances, for people to be able to sort of mourn in different ways and allow those cultures, again, to see themselves sort of reflected in the spaces. And in addition to that, there was this intentional desire to think about the orchestration and sort of flow of the landscape as something that wasn't linear. This idea of really sort of shaping your experience as these victims themselves are sort of navigating the world. And something that, was so important in our process was thinking about the integration of ecology and, this sort of sensitivity to, querying ecologies and intersectionality within cultures within the plant palette itself. So, landscape heterogeneity is really about bringing these things together. So it was amazing because when we put together sort of this robust sort of plant palette for the sites, it was really focused not just on sort of ecological benefits and habitat value, but the provenances and origins of the individuals that were lost and having fauna and flora that reflected those identities and really started to stitch together this sort of like biodiversity driven design that is not just reflecting, again, it's not just diversity for the birds and the bees, but it's for culture and people as well, so that you can sort of see yourself in the vegetation, in the materiality of those spaces. The next project I want to share with you all too is the work we've been doing for the Port of Los Angeles in LA. And I'm super excited to share that we just broke ground on the second phase of this work. And this is a really interesting community. So we're kind of going all the way to the West Coast here in Los Angeles. So this is the city of Wilmington, which is just south of LA and located along the coast. And it's situated adjacent to the largest port in America, which is the Port of Los Angeles. And this is a community that I can only define as being the most resilient and beautiful community I've ever worked in, because this community has been sort of fighting for environmental justice for so many years, and for their right and our responsibility to create spaces that are reflective of their identities and bring health to their communities. And what was so interesting about this work is that, when we first started our work with the Port of Los Angeles and the city of Wilmington, it was right at the sort of peak of industrial waterfronts. And, you go on Lanzine and it's like all these amazing European waterfronts that use the cargo ships and the cargo storage containers to create cool hipster-like places to eat. And, it was so funny because as designers, you gravitate to these things that are, front pages of magazines. But when we started listening to the community, and I think that was with so much intention, it really made it clear that this community wanted nothing to do with industrial waterfronts. They have to deal with port operations and oil refineries just next to their homes. And it's a constant reminder of the injustices environmentally they face. So they, when we started our engagement, it's like, no, we want the furthest thing from industrial. We want this to feel like an oasis for our community, something that is truly reflective of us and our resilience in this place. And, as something that is so critical here is, when working in areas like Los Angeles, we have to sort of mitigate a lot of the sort of pressures on the environment related to droughts and really thinking about plant sensitivities and creating spaces that really work with the community, right? So, I think there was a sort of trade-off here where, of course, we would love to put in chaparrals here that really evoke sort of the natural ecology of this part of California. But we also have to remember that we have to balance that with community needs. And this is a community that didn't have access to open space. So we had to think about, open turf fields that really accommodated, sports and soccer, which was such an important part of the community fabric here. And in addition to that, I think something that is so important about the work we have done here, the design is super beautiful, but this image is the image that really makes my heart melt, because not only did this project sort of work to create a landscape project and park that sort of embodies this community, but it enabled them and empowered them to continue to fight and advocate for more justice in their communities. And I'm so happy to report that we are now just breaking ground on the next phase, which is their first window to the water, their first access to engaging with the water that, the port has occupied for so long. And so I wanted to share these case studies as a way in which to sort of illustrate how landscape heterogeneity within my practice is being applied at different scales. And another sort of interesting part of this is data mapping, which is a really fun sort of deep dive that I did within this work. And, when I first think about, how we think about the mapping of our ecological systems, design with nature is the first thing that comes to mind. But when I think about sort of how are we mapping these anthropological systems, and what's our theory and philosophy right behind this, it brings me back to, texts from William White, that, again, it's just like, there's such a disconnect there in terms of the level of rigor and documentation we're doing to actually theorize and spatialize how humans actually interact and move through the landscapes we create. And I just, there's a deficit there that really needs to be filled. And I think we're at this really interesting point in our profession where we can really leverage technology to fill in those gaps. And, it started for me as, so much of this sort of qualitative data that's often feelings related or experiential for individuals or visceral is often in postcards. And then this turns into a spreadsheet and we never see it again, and it's never sort of becomes a part or becomes spatialized in a way that really helps us to sort of go beyond these postcards and think about, what does this mean? Because these experiences, these feelings, these qualitative attributes all are spatialized. And we need to be thinking about ways in which data visualization can sort of get us a little bit closer to understanding that. And this data visualization example that was done here for Voice at the Table is really thinking about, how do you map like affirmative spaces within the community, right? How do you map how different sort of respondents spatially see color and materials to sort of inform how that changes neighborhood by neighborhood or block by block. And I think it's that level of specificity and nuance that allows us as designers to become better at ensuring that we're not sort of coming in and washing away all of the inherent beauty and resilience that's already in place. And something that we've been sort of testing, and I don't know, let's see if my screen, can you all still see my screen? I think so. Is this sort of idea of, using sort of Google Street View as a way in which to do analysis and tap into sort of everyday urbanism as a way in which to define new vernaculars. So I think there's so much to be said about how communities cultivate and create spaces themselves, and what we can learn from sort of undesigned spaces as a means for sort of illustrating to us new design vernaculars that perhaps we may have not sort of taken into our approach. So this tool is really meant to sort of really illustrate that in a meaningful way. And, something that, has been a fun part of this is, when I go back to this image of the affirmative spaces, we have to think about also visualizing that. So it's great to show it in map form, but, what does that compilation look like? And I think it's this collage, which was done by Mel Isidore, is a great example of how we can really start to stitch together that vernacular, right? So these are all spaces within the community of Roxbury that, again, illustrate what is affirmative. And, it starts to, there's a materiality here that really comes through and should be part of our inspiration. And something that we as part of sort of this landscape heterogeneity process is that we're trying to move away from using precedent images within our design process and really open ourselves up to the community letting us know what is sort of deemed design excellence to them, and use that as a way in which to create a palette and really start to shape, right, this vernacular, as you see on the screen, that tells us what those elements are and how that materiality can be manifested in those places. Because this is very much about placekeeping. It's gentrification isn't just the economic impacts, but it's also aesthetically, when we come through and design these beautifully perfect landscapes and don't take into consideration, what the community sees as beautiful, I think we do a disservice to that community itself, and again, aren't really representing their values and needs. And something I'm really excited about with this research is that we're also thinking about how to bridge the sort of linguistic divide in sharing this work with the larger public. So I'm working with Sabrina Doris-Saville, who's this amazing illustrator here out of Boston. And early in the new year, we're going to be releasing this book that's sort of this illustrated version of this vision, right, for spatial pluralism, which is this sort of landscape heterogeneity process that I've shared with you all today. So be on the lookout for that. It's going to be really beautiful piece of literature. And finally, I want to end with just saying that heterogeneity and landscape heterogeneity specifically is about difference. And my daughter is really fascinated by space. She has these very intellectual questions about our place in the universe, if there's multi-universes. And, it brings me back to entropy, right? And this notion that it is this sort of change, it is this difference that makes us who we are. we are stardust. And I don't know who told us that we need order, that we need perfection, that, we all want to live in a utopic society, because I speak for myself here, but I like who I am. I want to be different, and I want the world to embrace my differences. And Richard Sennett really writes about this in his work around the co-science of the eye, where he really talks about, democracy is sort of based on our ability to see our differences, right? And that the public realm is a space where we can do that, so that we can build sort of empathy, which sort of predisposes us, right, to democracy. And I think it's such an important part of what this work is about opening the doors to difference, to different perspectives, to different vernaculars, and seeing where that takes us into the future. Because for me, our future isn't this utopian ideal. It's about enacting heterotopias. It's about protopias. It's about, thriving BIPOC bodies in public space. And I'm fully committed to expanding our profession and seeing these sort of design experiences and vernaculars enacted in the landscape. So, this is just meant to be an inspiration to you all as students, to go out there, to believe in your lived experience, and to have that guide you in how you create public spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. That was exciting. Images were great. And I'm sure it's a story that many of our viewers have not actually been tuned into. So I think it's really, really good. We have a number of questions that are that have come in. I hope we get others as well. One of the questions is it challenging to make it recognizable who a space is designed to serve? Do you feel that it is recognized by people not in that community, or does it require additional work for it to be known or understood?
That's a fabulous question. And I think we have to first understand where we're operating from and acknowledge that first. And it's sort of this understanding that, often our creation of public spaces is centered around white bodies in public spaces, and that's the norm. And I think what's important about this question is that we have to make this space for us to be able to break apart from that. Because this sort of false sense of, we're creating spaces that are welcoming for all sort of hurts us in that creation, right, of public spaces that identify with these communities. Because what we want to do is to be able to actually open ourselves up to saying, yes, this is a Black landscape. And yes, you can go there and be there, but it is perhaps not designed in the aesthetic that may make you feel comfortable. And it's about, really creating the space for that discomfort to occur in our society, and for us to be able to see that difference enacted in those spaces. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of analysis, a lot of listening to communities. And honestly, I've been working all over the country, and we have to remember too that it's not as easy as like they're going to come and tell you what they want. You have to remember that from a sort of societal standpoint, these communities are often told that they themselves are not capable of creating beauty and resilience. So how do we make the space for healing, right? To get us to that imaginative space that allows those people to see themselves thriving.
I have a question from me. I haven't sent it in. So in a firm like Sasaki, which has a long, storied history and a diverse office culture, how are your efforts, how do your efforts fit in the office? How are they received? And is there great support? Is there some intransigence? or is there, it took a while to get recognized and now we understand where she's going and this is quite interesting? Your mic is off.
Oh, can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So, I think for me at Sasaki, when I first arrived, I'm a Temple University grad, super proud. And I was entering an office with a lot of GSD and MIT grads, and I was just like, whoa, not Ivy League. I don't feel like I belong here. But it quickly became apparent to me that Hideo Sasaki's intention for the firm has prevailed through all of that. And, at our office, it's really funny because we always say that contribution is the only value, right? That what we want to do is bring value to the table as a contributor. But Hideo expanded on that. He said that it's to allow different perspectives to harmonize problems, right? For us to sort of come together around a problem and solve it with our different perspectives. And I think that truly came from, his own background. He was a Japanese American who was in an internment camp and then went on to start this firm. So I think that has shaped our practice. And I think, I think my arrival at Sasaki, really worked when we were discovering that, sort of rediscovering that, and really working hard to sort of allow that DNA that is what created Sasaki today to sort of be enacted, right, in our projects. And I think it's about making the room for these ideas to emerge. And I'm fortunate to work for a firm that has allowed these ideas to come through. And we're seeing great values. I think our clients are asking for this as well. Society is asking for it. And I think the two demands together, have created the perfect storm. And it's not just about, my perspective, but it's about how do I make room for others also to come in and to be able to share their views. Breeze Outlaw is this amazing designer you all need to keep an eye on, who's also at Sasaki really doing some innovative work around intersectionality in landscape architecture. So I think it's not smooth sailing, but I think it is sort of this recognition of where our firm came from, how our founders' own lived experience shaped how we created sort of an interdisciplinary practice, and how we can sort of manifest that into the work I'm doing today.
I have a student question, and I may add a little piece onto it. It says, what is one of your favorite ways for reaching out to a community to gain feedback from participants?
This is a great question. And so I'm going to pivot a little bit here just to kind of give you a sense of my thinking. So when I visit a new city or I'm starting on a new project, the first thing I want to do is go get lost. I want to get lost in that place and find myself and sort of really feel like I'm a part of the community. And when I think about engagement strategies and what's my sort of favorite tactic, there really isn't. I'm really curious and I'm always trying to change things up. For example, we're just starting some work in Boston related to resiliency, working in a Latinx community. And we're thinking about, doing cafecito sessions, doing an engagement strategy where we're using the form of having coffee, which is a cultural norm, as a way in which to engage in dialogue with communities. So, for me, it's not necessarily one desired path, but more so this state of consciousness where I'm always trying to sort of find what the pulse is of a place and its people and use that as my ultimate source of inspiration.
All right. Do you have, I have to assume, just based on looking at your work, that you are successful in getting underrepresented populations around the table. How does that work in public sector work?
I think it starts with intention setting. And I think it's important because sometimes our clients may not be aware that they really need that type of representation. But it's our ethical responsibility, honestly, as landscape architects to do so. And we need to start doing more of it. When you look at ASLA's sort of code of ethics, it's right there. But I don't think many of us understand that we not only need to fight for trees, but we need to fight for people, and we need to advocate for them, and that we have great responsibility in the shaping of the land. Because as I said earlier in my presentation, it is always an expression of power. And it's so important to work with clients to educate them on how we can make that sort of power move more equitable and accessible to communities that often aren't represented. And it's about making the room for that. It's about intentionally ensuring that they're part of calls, that, community advisory boards are paid, that this isn't an extractive sort of communication channel. So a lot of this is about, having that responsibility as a landscape architect, and then building empowerment within those communities.
Thank you. Next question. So how do you feel landscape design can inform or contribute to unlearning, deconstructing?
I think it has to. I think so many of us go into design education with this notion that, we're taught, or even when we start, our practices and go into the world, as you all will, in a couple of years or very soon, apprenticeship sort of perpetuates this process because it's about learning the same things that everybody else has been doing over all these years. And it doesn't really make the space for us to innovate as a profession. So I think we have to be revolutionary and speak up when it comes to our need to understand our history more deeply, to understand that landscape architecture never started with Olmsted. He never discovered this. This land had been managed for so many years, and it was done by Indigenous communities, and they get zero credit for that. It starts with us, acknowledging every time that we work on these projects that we're working on Indigenous land, and that it isn't the sort of transactional acknowledgement, but that's something that they're equal partners at the table, and that we are, honoring that past and commemorating it in a way that pays justice to them. So, I think a lot of this is about just ensuring that we as landscape architects push back, because if we don't, we're going to be seen as a profession for the few, and the rest of the world, outside of the United States, is designing landscapes without landscape architects. So I think we have to really tap into how we can be more accessible, more inclusive to those communities, and I think that starts with a lot of that unlearning, a lot of perpetuating the very issues we're trying to undo in society today.
Thank you. I have a student question for the Los Angeles Port project. Does the light post design have a specific purpose, such as preventing people from damaging them or weather protection?
Not specifically. That the design of those light poles, oh my gosh, there's a long story about those. But we wanted to do, the community really wanted something that was vibrant and that really reflected sort of the sort of modern aesthetic of the site. And I think, we sort of arrived at that design, and then the port itself has some very strict regulations around lighting. And because we are in California, we have to deal with seismic action. So, from a structural standpoint, there are a few things there to take into consideration. But I think, that angle you see there is the same angle that's used in the bridge, which you may have not seen in the images. But I think it's about the line that we were making back to the community rather than it sort of being used as a deterrent.
All right. I have another question from a student. Do you find that minority communities are concerned about gentrification occurring and may be reluctant to have a design project in their community?
God, 100%. It is, you know, when you think about these new landscape projects coming into these communities, they're afraid. They're like, oh, there goes our neighborhood, you know. And I think a lot of this is that we have to understand the aesthetics of gentrification. When I talk about homogeneous space making, I'm very specifically talking to that because there is an aesthetic. There are markers within the landscape itself that make communities of color feel unwelcomed. And it is so important for us as landscape architects to unpack that and to allow for the community to define what that beauty is, right? Because then we're actually creating something that is of place and that is using a similar vernacular to what's happening there. And I think it's a hard balance. Well, you know, I'm not going to sort of sugarcoat this because you have to balance, you know, underinvestment, right? Which is like that the aesthetic sometimes is a product, right, of not having investment in community. And then, you know, strategies and aesthetics in place, right, that are created as a means of resilience by the community. So I think we just have to be really intentional and walk that fine line and really listen and try our hardest to allow our biases as designers to be set aside so that when we're creating these landscapes, we don't feed into the gentrification cycle. We're not creating homogeneous spaces that often preclude communities of color in their identities.
I have another student question. I think they're moving in a particular direction. A few times you showed boards visualizing a landscape in an abstract kind of way. Do you ever get the community involved in making those?
Yes, and I think landscape representation is so important. And you know, I've had people approach me and say, "You need to write a book about landscape heterogeneity," and I have intentionally pushed back to that. And instead of creating, you know, a typical book with, you know, precedent images and lots of text, I'm creating a visual representation of it, right? Like an illustrated version of these concepts. And I'm doing that with intention because I think we as landscape architects need to figure out modes of representation that don't exist right now within our profession and that are really community-based. So when you saw those collages, you know, that was done through the feedback of the community and positioned in a way, right, that then reflected back to them the thing that made them feel affirmed, that made them feel welcome in communities. So I'm really excited about you know, you as students really innovating that, really bringing in your talents and showing us new ways to represent things, to allow for imagination to sort of come through. Like let's free ourselves of, you know, these standard perspective images and like where does that take us? You know, I'll refer Sarah Zwady is doing really incredible work, and I think you all should follow what she's doing. She's recently working on the graffiti park in Philadelphia, but she has a really interesting way of representation for a project they did in Africa Town in Seattle that's very futuristic. So I just, again, I'm really interested in thinking about what new ways of landscape representation can show us how, you know, BIPOC bodies are thriving, and it doesn't look like what we're doing today. So, you know, I'm in constant search, right, of testing new methods of representation.
I have a question about communication. Are there particular communication techniques that you have learned or that you recognize in yourself, and you have to prepare yourself for going into a public meeting with a diverse community or a different kind of diverse community? And how do students learn about this?
That's a really hard one, because I think I'm still learning it. To be honest, I think for me, it's about really paying close attention to the language I'm using, and specifically understanding my own bias as a practitioner, right, when I come into communities. So I'll share an example with you all that I think really shaped my trajectory around communications. When we were doing engagement with the Port of Los Angeles, we had shown an image of, images of the community. And there was this image of many community members street vending and selling food, which is in Spanish is called chatarra food, on the sidewalks. And it was a very, part of the identity when we were sort of walking through the neighborhood. And this young woman came up and said, well, you're showing us those images, but like what we want is, what Long Beach has and San Pedro has, which are the neighboring affluent communities. And they have a steakhouse and a strip mall like development. And that's what we think we want. And it really took me back, because I was like, oh, we were trying to be so sensitive. And I was like, oh no, like the Latina got it wrong with the Latino community. Like, how is this possible? So I think, it's just about being humble and also about understanding that, if I could do that all over again, maybe I would have started with like helping the community understand their own beauty, right? Their own resilience, because that desire to want what the communities have adjacent to them is again about sort of feeds into the societal notion, right, that these communities themselves aren't capable of defining beauty for themselves. That it's always about what the others have. And that, equity and equality isn't about sameness. It's about celebrating those differences, and that it can be done in a way that's truly reflective of that community.
I'm going to see, are there any other questions up on this list? I don't see any other questions. I just have, I guess I have a comment before we close for the night, but I think communication is very important. I think that in a diverse environment, diversity is defined very differently every place that you are, because it's not one definition. Do you believe that you have gotten jobs because of your cultural background? And do you believe that you have been excluded from getting jobs because of your cultural background?
Certainly, I think there is a sense of, pigeonholing, right? Or the token, individual in the room. And I think, I don't know, my parents always taught me that even if I was put in that room for a token reason, I'm going to prove to them that I deserve to be there. So that's the society we live in today. And I can't pretend that that doesn't happen. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to sort of succumb to those oppressive structures. And instead, I'm going to share that vibrancy. I'm going to share this sort of belief in my culture, in what my ancestors had to endure to get me to this place, as part of my process. And to really, and that has, inspired people to hire us, to want to engage, right? And I think it's bringing your authentic self to the table is what's key there. And, the reasons for why you're there, it's beyond me, but I'm sure, I'm sure I'm going to prove you wrong, if you think I'm going in there to do something related to my identity. So I just think a lot of this is, I spent so many years as a practitioner trying to be somebody I wasn't. And when I started stepping into my voice, when I started stepping into my authentic self, was when I was most valuable both to my teams and my clients. So that's my advice to folks, is really let yourselves and your lived experiences shine, because that's where value added is. That's where that contribution lies.
Well, I think that we've gone through the questions. You've given us a heck of a lot to think about. I want to thank you from the bottom of down from my shoes up. It's been a really great night. Your work is exciting. I think that I think the students are really excited by this. And I want to thank you for spending your time with us and sharing.
Thank you all. I'm so excited to be back at URI. You students are the future. And like I said today, what I presented is by no means a framework, but it's a way to inspire you that there are alternative ways to practice, and that design and the design process can be more inclusive than we've imagined. And I look forward to seeing what you all do, how you inspire me, to do things within my practices. So, the future lies in our ability to be brave and have courage to go out there and make that change. And thank you all for giving me the platform to share all of these ideas. I think a lot of this, lies on folks like you allowing this information to be accessible.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Great night. And 2 weeks from now, we'll have another exciting, stimulating speaker. Good night. Thanks for coming.